such poems. For these units which reflect the changes. I mean, you might even have read about the kind of changes we have envisaged in very close to 20th century, right? It was the period of war, it was in the revolutions of the French, industrial. There were so many, kind of, effects on these kind of writing literature, like maybe prose or poetry. Then you also have poems of some of the great poets like W.B. Eliot, Ted Hughes, along with Society and create into block 4. Yeah, here we have again a slightly change, a shift from the British. It is American poetry now. Now, as a poetic genre of the United States, emerged as the poetry of the colonists in the 17th century before the unification of the northern and southern states of America. Evidently, most of the early works relied on contemporary British models in form, theme, and diction. Now, the first internationally acclaimed poet was Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, H.W. Longfellow, who nearly surpassed Alfred Tennyson and became one of the fireside poets whose themes were based on domestic life and mythology and politics of the United States. Now, other popular poets of this period we're going to learn from American poetry is Ralph Waldo Emerson, Edgar Allan Poe, and Henry David Thoreau, who distinguished themselves their American identity and voice. Now, Emerson and Thoreau, with their ideology of transcendentalism, added freshness to American poetry through their non-conformist attitude and approach towards the important entities of American life. Now, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson changed, they have emerged as one of the truly indigenous American poets during the 19th century. Whitman for his free metric and direct expression, and Dickinson for the gnomic obscurity and irony. So, however, much of the American poetry published between 1910 and 1945 remains lost in the pages of small circulation political periodicals. And then you can also, when you talk about the American poetry, we'll also come across African American poetry, which emerged in the 20th century as a voice for freedom while contemplating on the social, psychological, and aesthetic aspects of the Black community. Right. Now, initially, the Black poets' survival amongst the white poets was a challenge where the African American sensibility, namely double consciousness, forces the Black writer to perceive oneself as both American and Negro. The greatest of the American poets like Langston Hughes, then you have Gwendolyn Brooks, Maya Angelou elevated their poetry that addresses the universal themes of suppression and discrimination. Right. Then moving on to the fifth block. That is the last block. Right. So here we are going to look into the Canadian poetry, Indian poetry, and Australian poetry. So Canadian poetry is, in spite of the widespread notion that Canadian poetry is a branch of English or French poetry, and to some extent American poetry, it evolved over a period of time, asserting its distinctness and individuality. Now, Canada produced many competent poets. Duncan Campbell Scott contributed to the formation of national consciousness in Canadian poetry. He was amply supported by poets like G.D. Roberts and Archibald Lampman, and Duncan Campbell reportedly developed close contact with wilderness and life of the red man and wrote tragic narratives like The Forsaken and At Gull Lake. Further, French symbolists influenced Canadian poets to a larger extent. Today, Canadian poets have established a distinct niche for themselves. What is fascinating is two women poets, Margaret Atwood and Phyllis Webb, produce some brilliant work. So this is all about the Canadian poetry. Now coming to the Indian poetry. Indian poetry in English emerged with the advent of colonial modernity in the subcontinent. It reflected features of the Indian society in transition. Now, new ideas about social progress were in dialogue with affections for tradition and its legacies. Such dialogues between the present and the past demanded new experimentations relating to poetic style. Such formal experiments, more often than not, sought to combine European and Indian elements and led to experiences of hybridity. Now, in post-colonial times, such dialogues were carried further. As we read through a small sample of poems by Derozio and Ramanujan, the Indian section will seek to introduce students to some of the thematic and formal concerns that constitute the historical process known as modernity in India. Now, Australian poetry. What are we going to study in this? The expression Australian poetry, many consider misleading, for it is made out of English with all its inherited genius. The poetry of native aborigines is considered as the authentic Australian poetry. Although we may not find much difference between the Australian and the British poetry, Australian poetry of the poets of the British descent not merely appreciated the aboriginal poetic traditions, but has been vocal in terms of castigating colonial exploitation of the aborigines. Now, Australian poetry today has emerged as a distinct field of study, producing some greatest literary pieces. Poets like A.B. Banjo Paterson, Shaw Nelson, Kenneth Slessor, Francis Webb, Randolph Stowe, Lisa Moray have made immune contribution. A.D. Howe is considered one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. His two outstanding works, The Return from the Freudian Isles and Conquistador, earned him great fame. So in the section on Australia, two poems of Judith Wright have been discussed. For her, poetry combines her love for Australia, concern for the aborigines, and highlights continued subjugation of women. Now, these are the 5 blocks we are going to take up in our forthcoming sessions. That is today, starting from today till, I think, till 6 classes. That is somewhere around Friday or Saturday, it might end up the last class. So this is just an overview of the entire blocks. Okay. So let me also ask you something. Are you all familiar with your textbook? Have you gone through? Because you've already completed your theory classes. I mean, offline classes, right? So this is kind of a revision for you. Being in an online session is kind of a revision for you. Am I right? So, yeah. Can I get an answer from you? Yeah? Okay. Have you read the textbook? Sem 4, poetry? Any answer from you? Oh, okay, okay. You all didn't have your offline classes. Fine, no issues. So, I'll just start with another thing is, are you comfortable with Okay, okay. Right. Are you comfortable in English language, or do continue? Oh, thank you so much, Rushdas Shakil. Right, thank you so much. Okay, right, perfect, perfect. Right, because sometimes we have students from the Telugu background. I think if needed, you can even, you can just request me or ask me if you want any other language. Right. So today I will just give you a gist of what these 5 blocks are. And from tomorrow onwards, I want you all to go through the first block, right? And all the 3 units of the first block, the poems and the poets. Then it will be very much easy for you to follow when I'm explaining. Okay, before that, let me just give you an introduction of poetry. What exactly is poetry? Okay. Now, poetry is actually, an ancient Greek um, word, in fact. It's an art form in which human language is used for its aesthetic qualities, in addition to or instead of its notional and semantic content. It consists largely uh, of oral or literary works in which language is used in a manner that is felt by its user and audience to differ from ordinary prose. So I'm just giving you, a background of what poetry is all about, because this is the semester where we're going to deal a lot about poetry. So before going to into learning this poetry, let us look into what poetry is all about. Okay. Now, it may use condensed or compressed form to convey emotion or ideas to the readers or listeners' mind or ear. That is what it is, isn't it? You've noticed it when you read some poem, you know, a piece of poem, each one has their own point of view. So it gives varied kind of meaning. So when you read a poem, each one feels it differently. So that's how it is. The poem, it kind of, it triggers your aesthetic sense. So that is what it is. But unlike prose, it doesn't stick to any grammatical rules. It's free of grammatical rules. And but of course, there are other devices which you come across when you read a poem. Like you have the metrical, the meter, the rhyming words, and you have the all these poetic devices used to bring in that kind of a beauty to the poem, the rhythm and the musical beat to the poem, right? Whereas in a prose, you might just end up reading it and it will be in the form of a sentence, and you have a syntax there, you have a grammar imbibed into it, and that's it, right? Now, because of its nature of emphasizing linguistic form rather than using language purely for its content, poetry is notoriously difficult to translate from one language into another. That is the reason why it is very difficult to translate, right? Possible exception to this might be the Hebrew Psalms, where the beauty is found more to the balance of ideas than in specific vocabulary. In most poetry, it is the connotations and the baggage that words carry that are most important. Now, these shades and nuances of meaning can be difficult to interpret and can cause different readers to hear a particular piece of poetry differently, right? So while there are reasonable, interpretations, there can never be a definitive interpretation, right? Next. Right. When you talk about the history of poetry, right? So poetry as an art form predates literacy, right? In pre-literate societies, poetry was frequently employed as a means of recording oral history, storytelling, genealogy, law, and other forms of expression or knowledge that modern societies might expect to be handled in prose. Now, the Ramayana, a Sanskrit epic which includes poetry, was probably written in the 3rd century BCE in a language described by William Jones as more perfect than Latin, more copious than Greek, and more exquisitely refined than either. So poetry is also often closely identified with liturgy in these societies, as the formal nature of poetry makes it easier to remember priestly incantations. The greater part of the world's sacred scriptures are made up of poetry rather than prose. Because we all know when people started to write, even before that, the narrative form, the oral, has developed to such an extent that they would pass on their beliefs or in the form of a story by narrating, either through a proper storytelling or through poetry. They would, recite poems and kind of narrate certain, convey certain messages through it. That was the way of passing on from one generation to another. So this is poetry is supposed to be a very early kind of a genre, right? Then you also have different forms of poetry. So when you look at poetry, it is not just one form. There are various forms. Like you have the ode, it's one form of poetry. Elegy, you have an epic, you have a dramatic monologue, you have sonnet, and then you also have a ballad. Okay, the epic and ballad, and then you also have a allegory, right? Then apart from this, you need to be familiar with these forms of poetry, because if you just go, as we read these poems through various ages, you come across different forms of poetry. Maybe in the Elizabethan age, you might come across a lot of sonnets there. Okay, as you move on, maybe during the Enlightenment period, where the uh, rhyme pattern and the metrical pattern was a mandatory thing to write a poem during the Enlightenment period. So if you might even come across poetry with a sort of rational poems or reason, a poem which has some kind of a reason, right? And then you also have this metaphysical poetry, which has come down during that period, towards somewhere close towards the end of Augustan age or the Enlightenment period. Then as you move down to Victorian age and Romantic period, again, the poems which talk about uh, love towards nature, the man, humanity, and love towards nature, and all such kind of things. So the forms keep changing. Then somewhere close towards the Romantic period, you will also come across poetry which talks about, you know, and something to do with grief, right? Like elegy, right? And they were called as graveyard poets. Poets who have written a lot about elegies, something which is a gray matter. I mean, kind of a sad issues, right? They were called graveyard poets, and that is kind of elegiac kind of a poetry. Then towards, I think, modern period or the modern age, somewhere close towards Victorian and post-Victorian, and somewhere around 20th century, you come across poetry which was free of all these kind of, the rules and regulations, so-called rules of poetry, free of it. And you would find them without any of these rhyming pattern or rhyme, and mostly of free verse, right? And and then there was one element which surfaced a lot during that period, which was called stream of consciousness. So this is how the poetry of different ages reflects the different styles of that period, right? So here and then you also have to be familiar when you are doing this poetry, familiar with the poetic terms. So like they are also called as poetic devices, right? Like for example, you have a alliteration, assonance, and then you have a rhyme, you have a stanza. Okay, all these are the devices. Devices are nothing but they are the uh, kind of tools which enhance the beauty of the poem, right? I mean, in terms of its listening, when you listen to it, it makes it more musical. Then you have you know onomatopoeia in poetry. Then you have enjambment, right? Then you have imagery in poetry. This is again one important element in poetry. Now, without which I'm sure the reader will not understand what exactly the poet is trying to convey. Imagery is like it evokes the senses of the reader, right? And the better the word formation in the poetry, the more effective it is to get the feel of the imagery. The images are seen, are visualized in our mind. Okay. Then you have a assonance, consonance, and alliteration in poetry. So this is like all these are nothing but they are the different devices used in a poetry. So when you talk about, so we're going to talk about this poetry as a genre. Okay. So prose is again one genre and poetry is another genre, poetry. Now in 16th and 17th century, now what were its key features when you look towards the Elizabethan period, you can call it as, and it's also a period which is called as early modern period. And early modern period also we have seen Renaissance, there was a rebirth in English literature and it was at its peak. And then as we do this, we are going to talk a lot about the poets of that period, right? So 16th and 17th century is also called as the Elizabethan period. And it has its own features, and those features are reflected in the poems which we are going to read it. Right. So I want, yeah. So tomorrow, the next class, I'll start with what a sonnet is. Now, basically, okay, let me just give you a gist about what a sonnet is. It's a 14-line poem, right? And first sonnet, which was introduced where it is divided into 8 and 6 lines. 8 is octave and 6 is sestet. Okay. Now, what is the importance of these lines in a sonnet? I mean, as you read it, in octave, there is a different theme. In sestet, again, there is something else to read into it. So this is how they've divided. So they would, especially during 16th and 17th century, they've given a lot of importance to this sonnet, right? So this is what, and then later, when you talk about the Shakespearean, it was divided into a quatrain, right? Quatrain is 4 and 4 and 4, right? Each quatrain had 4 lines. Unlike sestet and octave, it had 3 quatrains, 4, 4, and 4. Then remaining 2 were called as couplets. So together it makes 16. Like the actual original sonnet was octave and sestet, 8 and 6 lines. But later on, they have even, kind of customized it. They have brought out into a Shakespearean sonnet. The Shakespeare, especially the writer, had brought out this it's also called an English sonnet, which is which is made up of 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. Okay. So usually how the theme of the poem starts in the first quatrain, how the middle quatrain deals with that problem, and the third quatrain, how it will kind of, it tries to compromise, with the problem which was stated in the first quatrain. The last couplets are, then the poet is completely in tune with the problem. I mean, he doesn't take that as a problem, but he tries to accept it. So that's a couplet, the last one. Okay. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the various forms of poetry, and we are going to go block-wise. So the first block, I want you all to read and go through the units which are given in that. And tomorrow I'll be explaining the poems, okay, in detail. And also we'll talk a bit about the poets and the features, the key features of that particular block. Yeah. So any doubts you can ask me, but provided you read it, right? Because as you said, you all didn't have your offline classes. So make maximum use of this online class, right? So you read it and come, then I will explain. And on top of it, when you read it and then I explain, you will understand it much better. And the points whichever you don't understand, you can ask me then and there. Am I clear? Do I make some sense? You can unmute and answer me. Yeah, perfect. Yes, Sumaya. Right. So with this, we end today's session. Okay. And this was just an overview. This was just an introductory session. And from tomorrow onwards, all the 5 classes will be dealing with every day 1 block. So tomorrow, the first block. And the next day, it will be the second block, third block, fourth, and so on. It goes like this till your 5th class. Clear? So before I start a block, I will definitely look forward to your, any queries. And I'll also be sharing PPTs. And if you want, I can also pass it on to you. But along with PPTs, we are going to take up the lesson. Clear, all of you? Right. So we are done with the session. I am leaving the session now. Let us continue tomorrow with the first block. Okay. So I want you all to go through the lesson, or the block and the units, and quickly we will try to analyze the poems, understand the poets, and look into all the poetic devices and the form of poetry and so on. Clear, all of you? And as you read the poem and the summary, you will definitely understand how it reflects the, the background. I mean, the society at that point of time. You will definitely understand by reading the poems of that period. Okay? Right. So here I'm leaving the session. With this, we end the session. Right. Okay? You all understood now?